There is a particular kind of suffering that no one talks about honestly. It is not the suffering that comes from losing something. It is not the suffering that comes from failure or pain or grief. Those are real, and they are heavy, but at least they have a name. The suffering I am pointing to is quieter. It hides behind ambition, behind care, behind the desperate and relentless desire for things to go the way you want them to go. It is the suffering of a man who wants too much, not in the sense of greed, but in the sense of grip. A man who holds on too tightly to outcomes, to opinions, to results he cannot control. A man who has confused caring deeply about something with needing it to go a certain way. You know this man. You may be this man, and here is what no one tells you. The moment you loosen that grip, the moment you genuinely stop needing things to go your way, something shifts. Not in the world. In you. And because it shifts in you, everything around you begins to move differently too. The conversation you were anxious about goes better. The relationship you were suffocating with attention breathes again. The work you were forcing starts to flow. The opportunity you were chasing stops running. This is not magic. It is not some law of attraction fantasy or a motivational poster dressed up in ancient language. This is Stoic philosophy. This is a precise, disciplined, ruthlessly honest understanding of what you control and what you do not, and what happens to a human being when he finally stops fighting that line. Welcome to Stoic Zeno. If you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to bring the actual philosophy of the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, into the realities of your life, not as theory, but as practice. If what you hear today lands with you, like this video. Leave a comment, tell me where in your life you have been holding on too tightly. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Stoic Zeno, because this kind of thinking is rare, and once you find it, you do not want to lose it. Now, let us go deep. The Stoics had a concept that has no clean translation in English, but the closest we can get is this: the reserve clause. In Latin, it appears as hoc ego nisi sequid me impediverit. I do this unless something prevents me. Marcus Aurelius returns to this idea again and again in the Meditations. The idea is simple but almost impossibly difficult to live. You act with full effort, full commitment, full intention, and you hold the outcome loosely. You care about what you do. You do not need it to end a certain way. This is not indifference. That word is too cold, too detached. The Stoics were not passive men. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire for nearly 2 decades while fighting a catastrophic plague and endless wars on the frontier. Seneca was one of the most active minds of his era, a statesman, a playwright, a counselor to an emperor. Epictetus was a former slave who built one of the most influential schools of philosophy in the ancient world. These were not men who sat still and felt nothing. They were men who acted with everything they had, and refused to let the results of their action determine the state of their soul. That distinction is everything. When you care too much about the outcome, when you need the result, you do not become more effective. You become less. Your thinking narrows, your judgment clouds. You start making decisions based on fear and desperation rather than clarity and reason. You project onto situations things that are not there. You read into silences. You over-explain. You push where you should hold still. You retreat where you should advance. And you miss things, constantly, because your attention is split between what is happening and what you are terrified might happen. This is what Epictetus was pointing to when he divided all of existence into 2 categories: what is up to us and what is not. He was not making a philosophical observation. He was giving you a surgical tool. The moment you honestly apply that tool to any situation in your life, the anxiety changes shape. It does not vanish immediately. But it changes, because now you can see it for what it is: the suffering of a man trying to control what was never his to control. Think about the last time you were desperate for someone's approval: a boss, a parent, a person you were trying to impress, a stranger on the internet whose opinion of your work felt, for reasons you cannot fully explain, like a verdict on your worth as a human being. Think about how you behaved when you needed that approval. Think about the emails you rewrote 5 times, the conversations you replayed in your mind afterward, adjusting what you said, imagining better responses, wincing at what came out wrong. Think about how much of your interior life was consumed by that one person's reaction. A reaction that, in the end, you had no control over whatsoever. Now think about the rare times in your life when you genuinely did not care what someone thought. Not in the immature, defensive way. Not the brittle I don't care that is really just wounded pride with armor on. But in the true sense. The times when you were so clear in yourself, so grounded in your own judgment, that another person's reaction simply did not have the power to move you. Think about how you showed up in those moments, how you spoke, how you carried yourself, how the words came out clean and direct, without the static of anxiety underneath them. You were more compelling, more trustworthy, more effective. This is not a coincidence. This is cause and effect. Seneca writes in his letters that the wise man does not change his course based on the weather of public opinion. He charts by reason, not by applause or condemnation. And the reason this works, practically, not just philosophically, is that people respond to solidity, not to performance. When you are performing, they can feel it. When you are trying too hard, they pull back. When you need something from them, they become guarded, even if they cannot articulate why. But when you are genuinely present, genuinely unconcerned with managing their perception of you, something opens. The conversation becomes real. The connection becomes possible. The trust that you were desperately trying to engineer through careful behavior, it arrives. Naturally, the moment you stop engineering it, there is another dimension to this that lives in work, in craft, in the things you create and build. Every person who has done serious creative work knows this feeling. The project you were most anxious about came out stiff. The piece you wrote under pressure to be perfect, you can feel the pressure in the writing. The presentation you rehearsed 90 times came out rehearsed. And somewhere along the way, you have probably also experienced the opposite. The work that surprised you. The thing you made quickly, without too much deliberation, without the weight of needing it to be brilliant, and it turned out to be the best thing you had produced in months. This is not an accident of talent. It is an accident of freedom. When you need the work to be great, you are not working anymore. You are managing. You are watching yourself work, evaluating every sentence before it is finished, every decision before it has time to develop. You are acting as both the carpenter and the overly critical supervisor, standing behind the carpenter, and no carpenter does good work under those conditions. The supervisor needs to step back, not permanently. Critique has its place, and it comes later. But in the moment of making, the moment of real work, the mind needs to be clear of the outcome and present only to the process. Marcus Aurelius writes, "Do what nature requires. Get to work immediately if that's in your power. Don't look around to see if people will know about it. Don't expect Plato's ideal state, but be satisfied with even the smallest step forward." There is something enormously freeing in that framing. Plato's ideal state is the perfect outcome. The finished work that is exactly what you imagined, received exactly as you hoped, having exactly the impact you intended. And Marcus is saying, let it go. Be satisfied with the smallest step forward. Do the work. Do not need it to be the work. This is how you actually produce great work over a lifetime. Not by needing each individual piece to be great, but by caring deeply about the doing and releasing the rest. Now let us talk about relationships, because this is where the principle cuts deepest and is hardest to accept. There is a particular kind of love, a very common kind, that is really control dressed in warm clothing. It shows up as worry, as checking in too often, as needing to know how someone is feeling about you at all times, as the inability to let a conversation end without certainty that it ended well, as the habit of doing things for people not out of genuine generosity but out of a need to be needed, to be appreciated, to be confirmed. This is not love, it is dependency, and it does to relationships exactly what desperation does to work. It suffocates them. Seneca observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and nowhere is this more true than in relationships. The distance someone keeps from you for an afternoon becomes, in an anxious mind, evidence of fundamental rejection. A slow reply becomes a statement about your worth. A bad day on their end becomes a referendum on the relationship. You live not in the reality of the connection, but in a constant interpretive loop of what their behavior might mean, what they might be thinking, whether things are okay, whether you are okay with them. And this loop, this relentless, consuming loop, is built entirely on the premise that their feelings about you are what determine your stability, that your peace depends on their approval, that you are only okay if they are okay with you. Epictetus is merciless on this point. He does not soften it. He writes that you must understand clearly that what belongs to others is not yours to control, not their opinions, not their feelings, not their choices, not their affections. And the man who builds his peace on those things builds on sand. Every tide will threaten him. Every shift in someone else's mood will destabilize him. He will be a slave to people he may love deeply, not because they are cruel, but because he has handed them a power over him that no human being should have over another. When you genuinely release this, when you stop needing the people you love to feel a certain way about you, to say certain things, to behave according to your expectations, something extraordinary happens. The relationship exhales. The other person feels, often without knowing why, less pressure, less performance requirement. They can be themselves around you, because you are not watching them anxiously for signs of how they feel about you. You are simply there, present, not needing anything from the interaction, and paradoxically, irreversibly, they draw closer. This principle lives at the heart of something Stoic philosophy calls Amor Fati, love of fate. It is a Roman idea later refined in the work of thinkers who absorbed the Stoic tradition, and it means something precise. Not merely accepting what happens, but loving it. Not tolerating the outcome, but genuinely embracing it as the material of your life, exactly as it is. This sounds, on first hearing, either absurd or passive. Neither is true. The man who loves his fate is not the man who sits back and lets life happen to him. He acts, he chooses, he works, he fights where fighting is required. But he does not resist reality. And that distinction between resistance and action is the entire game. You can act without resistance. You can work toward an outcome without needing it. You can want something deeply, pursue it with everything you have, and still hold it loosely enough that if it does not arrive, you are not destroyed. This is not the posture of someone who does not care. It is the posture of someone who cares about the right things, the effort, the intention, the virtue of the doing, and has freed himself from the tyranny of results he cannot guarantee. Marcus Aurelius puts it this way: you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength, not peace as a consolation prize. Strength. The strength that comes from knowing exactly what is yours and refusing to squander your energy on what is not. There is a practical discipline the Stoics practiced, not just as philosophy but as daily exercise, that is worth naming directly. They called it the premeditation of adversity, or negative visualization. Each day they would spend time contemplating what might go wrong. Not in the spirit of anxiety, but in the spirit of preparation. They would imagine losing what they loved, failing at what they attempted, being rejected by who they hoped would accept them. And they would ask themselves, if this happens, can I still be a man of virtue? Can I still act well? Can I still hold my character intact? The purpose was not to expect the worst, it was to dissolve the grip of needing the best. Because when you have already mentally rehearsed the loss has less power to destroy you. When you have already sat with the possibility of failure, failure becomes survivable. And once failure is survivable, once rejection is survivable, once loss is survivable, the desperation lifts. You can act freely, not because the stakes are low, but because you have made peace with the full range of what might happen. This is what it means to stop caring in the Stoic sense. Not to stop valuing, not to become numb, but to stop needing, to stop gripping, to stop attaching your stability to outcomes that live outside your control. And when that grip loosens, even slightly, the quality of your attention changes. Your decisions get cleaner, your relationships get more honest, your work gets more genuine. The anxiety that was consuming enormous reserves of your mental energy starts to release those reserves back to you. And you find yourself, for the first time in perhaps a long time, genuinely free to act without the weight of needing it to go a certain way. Seneca writes, near the end of one of his letters, something that has stayed with philosophers and readers for 2,000 years. It is not that I am brave enough to face the worst. It is that I have understood clearly enough what the worst is, and found it smaller than I feared. This is the final move in this entire architecture of thought. The thing you are afraid of losing, the approval, the result, the relationship, the success. When you examine it clearly, honestly, through the lens of Stoic reason, it shrinks. Not because it is unimportant, but because its importance was inflated by your need for it. And once you see it at its actual size, not the size it appeared when desire and anxiety were magnifying it, you discover something unexpected. You still want it. You may still work for it. But you are no longer its prisoner. And the moment you are no longer its prisoner, you move through your life differently. The conversation you used to dread becomes interesting. The project you used to avoid because it might fail becomes worthwhile, precisely because it might fail, and that is not the end of you. The person whose opinion you used to need becomes someone you can simply engage with, honestly, without performance. The Stoics were not teaching detachment from life. They were teaching engagement with life on honest terms, the terms that actually exist, not the terms your anxiety demands. Act fully, care genuinely, hold loosely, release the outcome, return to the work. This is not a technique, it is a way of being, and it takes practice, real, daily, unglamorous practice. But the practice produces something no amount of striving or grasping ever will. It produces a self that is stable at the center, honest in its choices, and free in its action. That is what the Stoics were building. That is what this work is. If this landed with you today, if something in here touched a place in your life where you have been holding on too tightly, where you have been needing something you cannot control, then do something with it. Do not let the recognition fade, like this video. Not as a courtesy, as a signal that this kind of thinking matters, that it should reach the people who need it. Leave a comment and tell me where in your own life this principle is hardest for you. The job, the relationship, the creative work, the need for approval. Name it. Share this video with someone who is currently in the grip of something they cannot release. And if you are not already subscribed to Stoic Zeno, do that now. This channel exists to go deep into the philosophy that actually changes the way a man lives. Not the surface version, not the quote card version, but the real work with the real sources applied to real life. The Stoics did not promise you comfort. They promised you something better. Clarity. And with clarity comes the thing you were actually looking for when you started grasping in the first place. Freedom.